All right. Welcome to season 3 of the Revenue Rebels podcast, where we cut through the fluff and deep dive into things you can do immediately to uplevel your own go-to-market motion. And this time we're doing something a little bit different. We'll have Max here, who is our CEO and co-founder of Warmly, and he'll be joining as a co-host. Both of us are involved in different parts of the go-to-market world, Max being the sales leader specialist, while I've been spending the bulk of my time in marketing, product, and customer success. We figured that in order to maximize the value that the show brings to you, we should team up and cover multiple angles. The second thing is mid-market sales leaders, they don't get enough love. No catered content and no real discussions built for them. Since we've been working with more and more mid-market sales teams here at Warmly, we thought we'd dedicate this season to a sector that's becoming more and more prevalent by the day. So this first episode, we're addressing something that every sales team will encounter when they're going up market, the procurement team. That's why we have Mike Leonard joining us today. Mike has a uniquely valuable perspective on sales business development, having worked on both sides of the table as a procurement director and as an entrepreneur and sales consultant. He's negotiated hundreds of deals worth in excess of $500 million. He's worked as a procurement director for a company now worth in excess of $1 billion, and he's been managing partner at one of the UK's largest procurement consultancies. Mike, welcome. Awesome to have you. So why don't you tell people a little about yourself and how it relates to the topic we'll be covering today?
Yeah, sure. As just like you pointed out, I've been on the buy side for a number of years. I've been a procurement director. I've also been an entrepreneur. I've built my own companies. I've raised money. I've screwed companies up. I've turned them around. Luckily, all on my own dollar. There was no VC funding raised on that. I've worked with private equity companies with their portfolio-backed organizations. And a few years ago, I realized that, in fact, I was talking to my wife, who's an ex-CMO at big tech companies, and just about what I would do next in my life. What we came across was sellers are all fascinated by how buyers work. I've been an ex-buyer, so why don't I help sellers to sell more effectively and get better deals? When they meet bigger organizations, bigger clients, enterprise-type clients, they're scaling up. They may have got some funding or they may be self-funded, but they're now hitting bigger deals with bigger clients. They're bound to meet procurement people. So I give salespeople insights into what the procurement want, how do you deal with them, how do you qualify opportunities so you don't waste your time on stuff that you'll never really win? And then how do you negotiate better deals when you get shortlisted? And that's what I do now. Oh, as well as I'm building an AI product to do exactly that as well.
Good old AI product. Got to introduce that into this day and age. Yes.
I'd be remiss not to say I'm building an AI product. Yeah.
Awesome. Great, Mike. We're so happy to have you here, and such an important topic. I can't tell you the number of times that I've personally come across folks in procurement, anywhere from very surprised to very pleased with how the deal cycle went. And sometimes it feels like there's almost like a mystery box that you're opening with each new company in terms of what you're getting when you interact with the procurement team. Maybe just start out by telling us, who are procurement people, when are you likely to meet them, and what do they normally want?
So I think the first thing is there's a few myths. We're not the devil. As a seller, don't stick your head in the sand and ignore us. And the third thing is, we're not trying to put a gun to your head. So in my old role, we're not trying to kill SMEs. The opposite. We want them as part of the supply chain because they bring flexibility, they're entrepreneurial, they can often do things more flexibly. So think of them proactively rather than trying to avoid them. Second thing is, what do they want? Savings. They will always talk to you about savings. It's the number 1, 2, or 3 priority consistently across surveys. But they also want innovation. They also want quality and reliability. But they also want, and I think a lot of sellers don't think about this, they want to manage risk. And managing risk is a big thing for procurement people. Reputational risk, operational risk, financial risk, all elements of risk. Who are they? You can't really say there's a generic trait to procurement people, but what you can say is there's some common themes. They tend to be rationalists. They tend to be very analytical. They're great negotiators and well-trained, and they're tough-minded. And the kind of summary bit for this is, just because procurement asks for it doesn't mean they have to get it. It's just all part of that kind of procurement seller negotiation interaction.
Would love to have you tell us maybe about a time where there was some reputational risk, or you were worried about a deal that you were doing that a vendor put you off because it felt like this could come back to bite you. Because I think the risk piece is really interesting. And then maybe you could conclude by saying, on the other side, have there been any stories or examples where you saw a vendor do a really good job making you feel like there won't be any risk to bring on this vendor?
Sure. So if you look at when it goes wrong, The obvious one's kind of financial risk. So the problem that most kind of mid-market supply-side companies face in scale-up mode is working capital stretch. You don't go out of business because of profit. You go out of business because of lack of cash. And as a procurement person, what I'm really interested in is, how important are we to you as a supplier? And the supplier will say, oh, yeah, you're really important. You'd be our number one customer. Great. How big would we be in terms of a percentage of your revenue? And they go, you might be 30 or 40%. Could be bigger. And I'm like, whoa, okay, hang on a minute. So our payment terms are 90 days. And this deal's worth $500,000. So you could be out of cash, substantially out of cash, for 90, 120 days plus. So just talk to me about your balance sheet. How strong's your working capital? How good's your kind of cash flow? How well do you manage it? How well backed are you? And if the seller just basically ignores it, if the salesperson skirts around it and says, oh, we'll deal with that if we get to contracts, it's all fine, alarm bells will ring in my head. Flip it around. Tell a good story. When I start talking about working capital stretch, and then a well-informed salesperson and someone who's got a lot of experience says, it's a fair point, Mike. It's a really good point. So what we recommend is to manage that risk, a few things. First of all, we'll let you talk to our CFO. They'll talk you through how we're financed. They'll talk you through our working capital facility. Let's talk about the deal structure, and let's talk about the first year, second year, third year. Let's talk about maybe starting a bit slower to give you confidence. And then let's talk about how it scales up, and about payment terms, and about trades. How could we trade something with you in exchange for better payment terms? Do you offer SME payment terms? Now we've got a whole different conversation.
Sorry, just to double click on the word SME payment terms. I think that's very interesting because I'm used to getting the 90-day payment window always and not realizing there could be flexibility there. Maybe it sounds like there is a way to say, is there a different bucket or swim lane that we can move ourselves in to where we get paid more upfront?
Correct. Let's say you're talking to, I don't know, just a Fortune 100 company, and you get the standard MSA, and it's got the standard terms, and it's 90 days. If you're doing well. Some of them now are longer, sadly. And what the procurement person will say to you is, standard terms, you can't vary them. The MSA is non-negotiable. You're like, okay, can I just check something? Do variations go into the schedules? Does the schedule override the MSA? And they'll smile and go, yeah, legally, the schedule will override the MSA. So any variations you want to put in, tactically, you stick them in the schedules. That's where they go. So you don't mark up their document, the MSA. You take the points, you negotiate them, and you stick them in the schedules, number one. Number two, you say, have you ever paid any company on less than 90 days? And they'll say, yes. Under what circumstance do you tend to pay those companies on less than 90 days? If they fit into a certain category. Oh, what kind of categories? If they're an SME or they're in a certain minority group, which we're trying to support and encourage, geographically, politically, it could be all sorts, financially. Oh, that's interesting, because I think we fit into one of those buckets. Okay. So now you've got a discussion going.
Those are really great tactics. I love it. It reminds me of us dealing actually a couple of years ago with, let's call it a Fortune 50 company. We marked up their MSA. Big mistake. Another month of legal negotiation.
Yeah.
Before we realized, you know what? Let's keep the MSA the same.
Exactly.
And then the schedule is where we can really have the discussion.
Yeah, correct. You just pick up the points in the MSA and you stick them in the schedule. Yeah, yep. And see what they'll accept or what they won't accept. Like, for example, the favorite is obviously a completely unlimited liability. There's no cap. Absolutely. Lots of indemnities, unlimited liability. It's just not reasonable. So yeah, you stick those variations in the schedule.
From the indemnity perspective, actually, one of the things I've noticed is if you ask procurement to go back to the business unit and ask them, given that you want the solution, what is the level of risk you're comfortable with? They're often able to figure out, actually, like the level of risk is X million in risk. And even though it's a 2% chance of happening, that means we're willing to actually cap the liability.
Correct. Yeah. Or we need you to up your professional indemnity insurance. It's currently at 1. If you can get that to 5 million, and it's all risks, and it's any one occurrence, then yeah, that might work. Yeah.
Nice.
We're not the police.
No, it's important to call out, though. I'd love for you to help us split the phases of dealing with procurement professionals. So maybe help us understand, and we can do it in 3 parts, but I'm curious, like, how do you deal with procurement professionals before, during, and at the end of a sales cycle? So maybe start with the beforehand. What are some of the checklist items or things to think about when dealing with procurement professionals before the sales cycle?
So number one, procurement, it's not their money. It's the budget holder's money. If you're selling a tech solution into their tech function, then obviously it's the CTO's money. It's their budget. However, procurement are the guardians of that kind of money to ensure it's spent well. They don't have the right to say no, but they do have a big influence. So why do I say that? Imagine a sales cycle. You go into a CTO and you start talking about a $500,000 deal and you're shaping it and it sounds good. And CTO's going, I think you've got a chance. And yeah, and then all you have to do is get it past procurement. And then you rock up to procurement and you bang on the door and they go, who are you? What on earth are you doing at my door? I've got loads of companies like you. So thanks, but no thanks. So that was just 9 months of your life down the toilet. Instead, before the sales cycle starts, 18 months ideally, you've got a list on your wall. Max, you probably got a list on your wall as CEO of the companies you want to target. You've got your top 20 pinned to the wall and you look at them every day. Look at those top 20, find out who the procurement person would be that deals with you, build a relationship with them, a meaningful one. Send them thought leadership papers, invite them to breakfast targeted at procurement people, engage with them in meaningful industry conversations about where the market's moving, some of the myths about AI and some of the non-myths about AI, some of the truths. 18 months ahead of actually doing a deal, maybe 12. And then when you get to talk to the CTO about this $500,000 deal, early in the sales cycle, so you're now in the sales cycle, so we've done the before, now you're in the sales cycle, just say to the CTO, look, in our experience, given we're talking about maybe $500,000, maybe, typically procurement have a real strong view on this. Can we get them involved now? Can we just check with them? How do we get onto your preferred suppliers list? How do we become a supplier? What checks do you need to do? Who's already on your preferred supplier? Who would this, would it go to RF? Let's just have a conversation with them. They're just another stakeholder to involve in the process. And then thirdly, if you do get through to the back end of the deal, whereby you're starting to be down selected, you're probably our preferred supplier, we're going to start negotiating contracts with you. Stop selling. Just stop selling and start negotiating. You've done the selling. Now you've got to work out with me how we're going to get a successful contract for you and for us that doesn't kill you, that drives benefit for us, and that delivers an ROI. If you're a salesperson and you don't know how the value is created in what you sell, then negotiating the contract is going to be a disaster. So that's what I'd say.
Let's take that a little bit more. I think in our go-to-market tech space, like Warmly, for example, it's very easy to put up on screen, here's how much money we make our clients, great. But there's a lot of tools out there that are still valuable, helpful tools that can't always so easily quantify ROI. Maybe talk to us about how do you have a conversation with procurement when procurement says, okay, you want $500,000, then you better be making us $2 million in sales. And you're like, hey, like we're a HR tool that helps with employee happiness. What do you do then?
The first thing you do is take a step back and say, okay, so we're not a revenue driver, but we are an employee retention enabler. And you start to say, so although we don't drive revenue, what we do improve is retention. There's got to be a business benefit somewhere about what we do. And then you start to draw them a value map. I'm not looking for a spreadsheet that's accurate about the ROI. What I'm looking for is something that's directionally correct. So that when I go and see the CFO and we talk about this $500,000 deal in budget or maybe even out of budget, and I've talked to the head of HR about this opportunity, we've got a common framework to talk around. It's not my job to tell you as a salesperson how much value you create and in what buckets that value turns up. That's your job. If you fail to do that in an environment whereby you can't prove the sales uplift or the profit impact, if you fail to be able to convince me that there's an economic value to this, I just won't go and see the head of HR. You just won't be on the radar. And that's the harsh reality.
That's so true. And I think very well said. The other thing that comes to mind for me is potentially having a conversation around relative to your other business priorities in the HR department, do we think that this tool will relatively, let's say, have a bigger impact on employee retention than our other three efforts? And so figuring out with your HR stakeholder, what are the 5 things you're going to do this year, and what are the like top level company wide goals that are trying to be accomplished? You can say, okay, we're definitely not as useful and valuable as number 1 and 2, but actually if you implement us, you could actually not even have to get to number 5, because probably, and again, this is something you can't quite prove, but you could say based on case studies, based on other customers, based on just the feeling of the HR director, this is a more valuable priority. And I've certainly found that can lead to, like you said, basically the framework for conversation where the CFO doesn't need a spreadsheet. They just need to gut check and say, yes, you can't have 6 priorities. You can only have 5. So if you can put this initiative as number 3, then that makes sense.
I think something else to add to that, Max, is what else are you using? So if you look at the HR tech stack and say, okay, what's in your HR tech stack? And they'll be a bit cagey, but they'll start to open up hopefully about, we've got kind of 10 solutions currently. There's an HR CRM, there's a talent acquisition part, there's a applicant tracking system. There's about, probably at least 5, not 10 or 15 tech components in the HR stack. And you go, okay, how about if we looked at what your real deep problems are, to your point, the business priorities, the business issues you're facing around the HR domain, and let's look at how your tech stack aligns with that. And then let's perhaps look at, is there a way of solving your problems in a different way at a lower cost to serve with a higher retention rate? Would that be of interest? I think most people are going to go, yeah, okay. If you ever read the Challenger Sale by Matt Dixon, that was all about challenging the client's thinking and problem solving together and building relationships. So the idea is you've got to talk to the client as a business person, as a trusted advisor, talk to them about the issues they're facing and help build solutions together as a collaborative solution set. And then look at the economic value and the cost and work out that there's broadly the right buckets that would convince the board to go, $500,000, it's worth investing.
So I had a follow-up on this. With regards to the Challenger Sale, you're trying to teach the customer something that they don't already know. So for procurement people, what is it? I understand that you said, okay, I understand the business value. That's not really my job. What is their job? And what does it mean to win at their job? What's the A+ of what they do? What are they trying to achieve? How do they win? And what can you teach them that's something that they don't really understand? What have you learned about procurement people?
Okay, so how do they win? There is absolutely a link to savings. So like it or not, most procurement people, not all, but most procurement people are comped on the savings they deliver. And there's a very rigorous way that you do that, about how you audit that, but they get a bonus based upon the savings they've delivered. So that's one thing. They have to do that. But that's not all. Yeah? Clearly, what they have to understand is the category they're working in. So to your point, Alan, let's just take a broad category. Let's take a scenario. So you're dealing with an organization, it's a Fortune 100, and you've met this procurement person. You look at their LinkedIn profile before you meet them, and that it's a retailer. And that for 10 years, they've bought apples, oranges, bananas, orange juice, and other vegetables. And you're like, wow. So they're in what we call direct procurement. Yeah? So they're a direct buyer. Every cent they save puts money on the bottom line. These are the toughest people you'll meet. Suddenly, they're now buying HR services in procurement. Okay, why are they doing that? They're on a journey. They're on their career journey. To become a chief procurement officer, you have to have bought direct and indirect goods and services. So now they're buying indirect. So now they're going to try and apply the same principles that they bought oranges to your HR software. How's that going to work? Really badly. Unless you can educate them about their category. So this is quite subtle, but the other win is being masters of their category. They have to understand their category, i.e. HR and professional services. It's a big category. They've got to understand it really well. If you can start to educate them about how the HR tech category works, not a sales pitch, but an industry pitch, what are the dynamics, what are the pitfalls, where are the risks, how's the market moving? If you start to educate me out of a negotiation cycle, you've got to do this before you start negotiating with me, I start to become more knowledgeable about the category. I start to become a better buyer in that category. I'm likely to call you again, Alan, and go, I've got something that we're looking at which may be of interest. Can we have half an hour? So that's how they win. They win by being masters of their category, very good at governance, negotiating great deals, and delivering savings.
What do you get by being really good at your category? Is it you get better alignment on what tools to buy for the business stakeholder? Do they provide feedback so you can be chief procurement officer one day? How does that all work?
I've not been in that role. I've not been in a huge company climbing the procurement ladder across categories, but I know people who have. And what I can say is, if you take procurement normally sit underneath finance. So often they're in finance, they're under the CFO, or they're under the chief operations officer, depending on what the organization. Occasionally they report to the CEO, but often it's into finance or into the head of operations. So that means that if you're in HR, and let's say Max is the head of HR, so you're the HRD, and I'm the kind of procurement person, and I sit within finance, I've got to build a relationship with Max in a way that helps him. And I say it sounds very simple, but Max has got a tricky job. He's running HR for a global Fortune 50 company. How do I add value to Max? We start with, you've got a budget, Max. Your tech stack might be, I don't know, $10 million a year. Can I help you get more bang for your buck? Not take money away from you, but get more bang for your buck in that $10 million. Now, Max is likely to say, yeah, if you can do that, Mike, that'll certainly help. So I'm building a relationship with Max based upon how do I help him get better outcomes for the same money. And that's why becoming a category leader is important, because doing that allows me to build a relationship with my internal business partners, IBPs as we'd call them, to make sure that I'm relevant. Otherwise, if all I know about is apples, bananas, and oranges, and say to Max, I'm now buying HR, how do you reckon Max might behave? You're as much use as a chocolate fireguard, Mike.
One of my hardest procurement cycles was somebody who I imagine sold bananas, apples, and oranges before, but they asked us to send a breakdown of our COGS, our cost of goods sold, because they were under the belief that software is like 90% margin, and so they thought they had a whole way to drive us down. And so they're like, look, we want you to make a little bit of money, but we're going to make you show us every cent this thing costs you. And if you're squeezing us for 80% margin, don't even think about it.
Correct. And the answer is no. You have no right of access to any of our cost base, any of our R&D budgets, the investment we've made over the last 10 years. The answer's no. I'll talk about value and the value we create and why we charge a premium for our software, for sure. I'm not giving you an open book into our business. It doesn't exist.
Speaking of deals that can go south and sour, tell us a little bit about how sellers out there might stop wasting their time on deals they can't win. So what are the kind of sales cycles where, procurement is going to be too much of a roadblock to continue, and where are the ones that there's opportunity to get deals over the line?
So the first thing is that every seller should have an opportunity qualification score sheet. If you've not got a score sheet, even a simple spreadsheet, and you're relying upon gut instinct, then that's a disaster. So if you're going to scale up, you need to have a formal qualification process that you can demonstrate why we're going to work on this deal. Here's a few simple things to stick into your qualification spreadsheet. A big one for me is you'll get the dreaded RFP, or it could be a formal client brief, either one. If they say you cannot meet the economic buyer or procurement and have a meaningful discussion until you're shortlisted down to the last three, and the deal's worth, say, $500,000, I would strongly recommend you qualify that out, unless you've got a really big strategic reason for bidding. Because the idea that as a procurement person, I've managed to write down exactly what my internal business partner really needs, the economic buyer, what the priority is today as opposed to 4 weeks ago when I wrote it, and all the nuance, the idea that I can get that right in a document, then have you bid for something by just writing it down in a document, and then I review it and score your homework before you get to talk to me and the economic buyer, is bonkers. So that's number one. Secondly is, if you don't understand the business issue or the problem statement that client's facing really deeply, and if you haven't solved it 10 times before and you can't prove you've solved it, what the benefits were, why on earth would you bid for it? Oh, because it's, it's something we're interested in getting into. It's at the periphery of what we do. I think it's a really interesting opportunity. It's with a Fortune 50. You just don't waste your time. You'll come second or third, if not fifth. Another one is simple. Is the incumbent bidding for this work? What's the competitive landscape? If they say we can't possibly tell you who the competition is, and we can't tell you if the incumbent's bidding, well, find out if the incumbent is bidding. Look up online, and if it's obvious, like it's an SEO service or something, or an advertising service, if it's obvious who the incumbent is, they're doing an okay job, and it's 3-5 years since they were last appointed, chances are it's just an exercise to do price comparisons, innovation comparisons. The incumbent wins well over 65% of those deals where they're bidding as the incumbent. So your chance of winning on a long list of 5 or 7 or maybe even 10, heaven forbid, is less than 5%. Don't waste your time. So you've got to find what I would call a kind of a wedge sale. So when we're taught enterprise selling, we go, okay, we're not going to shift a $500,000 behemoth of a competitor from what they're doing. Can we find something worth 30K, which solves a really pinpoint problem for a client that keeps us below the radar, doesn't threaten the incumbents, isn't RFP'd, is a consultative sale, and it's low value, low risk, but shows a route to where a lot more value could be created. That will work in the right circumstances.
Absolutely. Get your foot in the door, get to know people. Once you're in the inside, then you understand the incumbent. You get to get intros and meet the stakeholders who are using the incumbent, and then get to show your cards. And actually, we have one of our larger deals today is sort of, I guess that wasn't intentionally the strategy, but it has become the strategy, and now we want to replicate that more.
Exactly. And also, make sure that the incumbent doesn't find out who you are.
Yep.
If they do find out and they come and talk to you about being a partner, don't partner with them. Be polite, just avoid them because they want to kill you. No matter what they say, they want to kill you because you're about to eat their lunch.
I just want to keep track of time. We have a few minutes left. So 1 or 2 last questions for you, Mike. Talk to us a little bit about RFPs and winning in competitive bid processes. Any tips or tactics around how to, when you do know you're going up against other competitors, how to win?
So let me just give you like 3 or 4 points on that. First of all, if it's an RFP, let's assume that it's an RFP because it's a bigger deal. You've got to answer all the exam questions. So if you miss out some of the exam questions and you don't answer them, you'll get marked down. Answer the exam question, provide evidence where required to support your claim, and thirdly, provide insights that they hadn't even thought about, challenge their thinking. That's the first thing. Second, you must have deep sector insights. It's quite rare that I'll buy something from a supplier where you haven't worked in my sector at some scale. I do occasionally, but normally you need to know my sector. You've got to understand my sector. And the third thing I'd probably pick up is a really simple thing, but can be a real killer in the RFP response and your proposal response. Poorly structured documents with no executive summary, where I have to work to find out what's going on, will go in the bin. Because I'm reviewing maybe, at this stage, 5, 7 proposals. If you give me a 100-page document with no signposting, no executive summary, and you want me to work out what your real value add is and your differentiation is, don't be surprised if I don't reply to your emails. Oh, he's ghosting me. No, you wrote a dreadfully structured, incoherent document. Not ghosting you, you're not worth my time.
Mike, if someone were to poke you and say, hey, we want to make sure our RFP aligns with your company's sort of standards or best practices, could you send us an example of an RFP, even from years ago, that won in the process? Would you say yes?
Just for that again, Max?
Basically, would you be willing to send a prospective customer or vendor an example of a great RFP so they can try to match that style?
Definitely not. Absolutely not. Worth asking. I'll probably laugh and say, yeah, I get why you've asked, but I'll say no, thanks, no. Because then actually what happens is you come back to me and say, oh, Mike, the one that you sent me, we tried to replicate that, but we haven't got through to the shortlist. So we're a bit confused as to what it's like. That's not my fault, guys. That's not my fault. Do not blame me for you not winning at the shortlist point.
Then I guess for folks just getting to their first ever or second ever RFP, a small startup working their way into enterprise, just is the idea, hey, try some, you'll lose the first few, but then once you get a winner, then try to use that as the thing to replicate?
No. I would think carefully about how you're going to enter the enterprise market. Mm-hmm. I would get people on board, advisors, or hire people that have trodden that path before, and work out, okay, how are we going to get our win rate up to, on RFPs, say, as a start point, 30, 40%. That's the target. I have clients who have a win rate on RFPs of 80%.
Wow.
That's very rare territory, like really rare territory. So you have to approach it in a very systematic way, and you got to invest. Just like the typical Fortune 50 RFP that's worth, say, $500,000, say. I pick it because it's a good number, because it's that kind of sweet spot whereby it's not a massive deal to an enterprise, but it's worth thinking about and worth putting some rigor into. Yeah, that could be a 10 to 30 page RFP. Proposals could be 50 to 100 pages. MSAs that go with it, they could be 50 to 100 pages. It's a big undertaking. Average time to fill in an RFP for well-versed vendors that do this for a living, it's about 30 person hours.
Wow.
And that's at the conservative end. Win rates are about 42% for well-versed vendors.
Amazing benchmarks. That's really helpful for anyone listening.
And if you look at Lupio, for example, a company called Lupio, those kind of stats are from Lupio's surveys, which are very useful.
Mike, to wrap things up, is there anything that we should have asked you but didn't in the world of procurement?
Yeah, the last thing is negotiation. When you're shortlisted, you're down to the last one, you'll probably get words like, we've gone through a process, we're interested in working with you, we have alternatives, but we'd like to enter into a period of discussions negotiating a contract. Once that happens, you need to be really well prepared. You need to think it through way in advance, think through your negotiation, and start building a negotiation strategy, not merely half an hour in the cab before you get to the meeting. Mm-hmm. You could lose the deal at the last minute. Because remember, one really important thing. I have BATNAs. I have a best alternative to a negotiated agreement. I've just gone to market. We've had 7 suppliers. We got down to 3. You're the one we might want to work with. If it doesn't work out, Max, I'll just simply stop talking to you and flick into the one that came second or third. Mm-hmm. I've always got alternatives. So you have to prepare really well.
Mike, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for all of your insights here. I think we've all definitely learned a lot having it through our own painful process with the procurement team. I'll be taking those learnings into our next deals. How can people find out more about you?
Best thing to do is look me up on LinkedIn, Mike Lander on LinkedIn. Or if you want more insights like this, if you go onto our website, piscari.com, piscari.com, you can sign up to our Insights series, Insights and Tips.
Fantastic. People check that out. All right. Thank you very much, Mike.
Yeah, pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Max.